welcome to church. Wow, all right. Well, hey, if you have not met me, my name is Joel, and I'm thrilled to be with you as we kind of close out 2018. They brought the closer in for this one. And not just you guys here in Brighton, but also joining later online. I'm thrilled to be with you as we are in week 4 of Christmas List. Now, you might be thinking, Joel, aren't we done with Christmas time? Kind of, all right? We're in what we call this awkward in-between where Christmas has ended, but New Year's has not yet begun, right? Like, what day is it? I'm just impressed you're here, right? What's for dinner? Christmas cookies. It just exists, and it's uncomfortable and awkward, and we, I guess even as the church, don't know what to do with it. And I'll never forget when I came home from college one year, it was Christmas Day, and I wanted to deck out the house in Christmas lights. You know how your mom just has a billion Christmas lights? Mine did too, and so I decked out the inside, even the unfinished back part of our basement. And apparently, while I was doing this, I unplugged our large hunting freezer chest. It could have been anybody. And replaced it with Christmas lights. Now, I didn't know this happened, and so we went on with our festivities in this awkward middle week, and New Year's Day came, and I went down to go clean up the Christmas lights. And this freezer had been filled with meats, turkey, jams, soup. It's like my parents were getting ready for the apocalypse, and this was like their 10-year plan right here. And this week it had gone, well, unfrozen. And everything had kind of joined together in one gunk. It's being generous. And when I turned the corner to that back unfinished part of the basement and opened the door, I could see the stench in the air. And then I opened the freezer and it like split my hair. It was horrific. And I had to spend my New Year's Day knee-deep with boots scooping out gunk from the freezer. And I thought, there is not a better illustration out there for this week in between Christmas Day and New Year's. It's just messy. Right? It's still the holiday season, but you're at work. What's up with that? And your in-laws have left. Thank our good Jesus. But the house is a wreck. And we're just kind of existing. Like 2019, come on. Right? Last year was on a weekend. We got to wait till Tuesday this year. Like just kind of waiting and existing. And I don't know about you, but my 2018 wasn't easy. My guess is yours wasn't. We had financial, just unexpected stuff occur. Close relatives, my wife and I went through a divorce that we were heavily involved in, and it was just a hard year, and my guess is yours was just as hard, if not harder. And so you're sitting in these final days just waiting for 2019 to come, right? Half expecting Ashton Kutcher to come around the corner and be like, hey, this year, one big prank. You're all punked, and we're just going to do it 2.0. Again, some of you got that one. Ask your son. And it's just a mess. Well, here's my hope for today. My hope is that we do not use this last weekend of 2018 waiting or wasting, but expecting. Big things to come. Yes, 2018 was a mess. This week might be messier, but there is something in 2019 I believe that we could determine today that could change everything. Goals to be set, resolutions to live out in the year to come. In fact, in this 4th week of Christmas List, that's the very list we're talking about today, the resolution list. And so I did some research on the top 2019 resolutions. I'm a pastor, I only work 1 day a week, so I had the time. And I got the top 10 resolutions of 2019. Anyone think they know number 1? Yeah, I heard it, lose weight, that's right. 2 and 3 are related. Eat healthier, exercise more. 4, have more money, it would be nice. 5, focus on self-care. 6, read more. 7, make new friends. 8, learn a new skill. 9, get a new job. And 10, appreciate your pastors more. It doesn't say that. Take up a new hobby. And in general, those are not bad things. Right? It's not wrong to look back to your past year and to say, you know what, I messed up a little bit in this year. And this next year, I'm going to get some things right. And I'm going to set some goals, and I'm going to go after them. And resolutions in general are not a bad thing, but the issue is research shows about 2% of New Year's resolutions actually ever get accomplished. And many would argue that's because you set resolutions too high, too big. I'm going to work out an hour and a half a day. Sure you are. Right? I'm gonna lose 50 pounds and then you gain that 1 pound and you're just deflated and the resolve, the resolution never happens. Well, today I'm going to argue that it's just possible that your resolutions and my resolutions are not failing because they're too big, but because they're not big enough. Let me explain. Every one of those resolutions I just read off had something in common. They all had to do with me. They all had to do with my life getting better, my life getting skinnier, my life getting wealthier. Today, my hope is that we walk out of here with the resolution outside of our own skin altogether. A resolution focused on other people. A resolution bigger than we could accomplish on our own. A resolution worth living for. In fact, I believe the very best thing you might be able to do in 2019 for you might have nothing to do with you at all. And so to do this, to set a resolution worth living for, we're gonna look at a guy today from Scripture who knew how to do this. This is a man named Paul, and he knew how to live a life worth living for. And it might not be the life you expect, and it might not be the luxury you expect, but he knew how to chase after goals, resolutions on this side of heaven with a different perspective in mind. Now, if you're new to church, Paul wrote over a third of our New Testament that we have in our Bibles. Bible's kind of split in two parts. And Paul was not only a good writer, right? He wrote these letters. Paul was a master church planter. And within his first few years, he had huge churches planted all along the Mediterranean Sea in these major port cities. In fact, some people have argued that it's because of the churches Paul started that the gospel was ever spread, obviously generations to come, to the United States. And it might be because of Paul's mission, Paul's resolution, that we get to sit in this church today. And we don't have time, I wish we did, to look at all of the churches Paul wrote to and all of the churches Paul started. So today we're gonna zoom in on one. We're gonna zoom in on the church of Philippi. It's simply called this because it's in the city of Philippi. And in the book of Acts, we see Paul begin this church. In fact, we see him in prison, and we see him lead the jailer to Christ. And then he goes home, and he baptizes the jailer and his entire family. And we see a little girl named Lydia who is demon-possessed, that he cast the demon out of. And the jailer and Lydia, these would have been the type of people Paul would have started the church of Philippi with. And then a decade later, Paul writes back to this church. This is the book we now have known as Philippians. Now, Lydia would be a teenager by now, right? The jailer started a small group and it multiplied. Like, this is years later writing to a church that he desperately, desperately loves and cares for. However, in chapter 1 of verse 13 and 14, we see that Paul is actually not writing from anywhere, he's writing from prison. Now, nobody knows which prison this is. Many would argue it's a Roman prison. And if you know anything about Roman prisons, they do not treat people fairly. And Paul is writing, encouraging a church not in chains about how to live a life worth living, about how to set resolutions worth chasing. If you got your Bibles, we're gonna pick up in Philippians chapter 1, verse 20. Philippians 1, verse 20, this is Paul speaking, and he says this: I eagerly expect and hope. You can hear kind of the resolution language. He says that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body. Now, this is interesting. This is not a resolution yet for the church of Philippi. This is for him. I and my body, right? In fact, he goes on. Whether by life or death, then he specifies, here's the big resolution, for me, for Paul, to live is Christ and to die is gain. Now, my guess is if you've been around church for a while, you've heard that verse before. In fact, you might have it tattooed right on your forearm. But you may have never understood what Paul was doing here. What Paul is simply doing here is he is redefining what life is. He's redefining what it means to live. Remember, Paul's in chains. I don't know if his hands were bound or just his feet, or if he had to audibly say this and someone scribed this, but Paul is in chains, writing to people not in chains, saying, I'm freer than all you guys. And I, in chains, have a resolution for myself worth living for, and it's Christ. In fact, he says, hey, one of you Roman jailers want to come in here and you want to kill me? Guess what? I'll be with Jesus, so it's gain. In other words, what Paul is saying here is he has found something, a resolution not only worth living for, but worth dying for. And he's challenging the church of Philippi, and I would argue the church today, to do the same. And so if you had to redefine what it means to live, if you had to choose a new resolution outside of your own body that was worth chasing, and once again, these other resolutions aren't bad things. I'm not saying you couldn't lose 10 pounds and couldn't have a better budget. I'm saying if you're gonna focus in 2019 on one thing, what would it look like to find something, Christian or not Christian in here, worth living for, maybe even worth dying for? For you, to live is fill in the blank. I'll never forget when I was in college, I would come home and I would work these church camps each week of the summer. And there was one specific church camp I will never forget. It was in northern Iowa. It had this long Cherokee Indian name, but we just called it Camp K. And Camp K was an ultra-conservative church camp. They had all their counselors, including myself, in the choir, which you don't want. And they had all these crazy rules. One of the rules was you had to wear closed-toed shoes because they didn't want anyone to stumble. Now, if you're new to church, that doesn't mean trip. Like my toes were showing too much skin, which nobody wants to see anyway, so I was fine with it. And I'm at this church, and I can't wear my Birkenstocks, and I'm in the choir, and I'm sleeping on a hard bed, and I'm literally asking the question, what am I doing here? And I'll never forget, a few days into the camp, I met a sophomore guy named James. James was one of the students assigned to my cabin, and James was asking a very similar question, what am I doing here? However, he was not just talking about Camp K, he was talking about life in general. They'll never forget, a few days into this camp, after the choir of counselors had left the risers, the pastor, the preacher, gave this call. He said, if anyone in here is willing to toss their old life behind them and live as Christ. I mean, so much so that if you were to die, it would be gain because you would see Jesus. And James went forward and accepted this call. And for James, this was now not just a resolution, but a solution. James had found purpose. And finding purpose for James changed everything. In fact, I wouldn't trade the conversations that we had, the late night conversations in the days to come, for basically anything in this world. He said, Joel, remember how I would talk about those kids in my high school that made fun of me? I said, yeah. He said, I'm gonna go back and lead them to Jesus. He said, hey, remember how I told you my mom used to drag me to youth group and drag me to this camp? Yeah. I'm gonna go back and be the biggest leader that group has ever seen. And James had found purpose to live as Christ, and it changed the course of everything. And little did I know, while that was happening, God was putting a purpose on my heart and my soul as well. In fact, weeks went on and I saw stories of James's experience from death to life over and over and over again. And I saw students of the generation behind me come to know and experience and encounter and taste Jesus. And I said, I don't know what extent, but I will be involved in that in some aspect for the rest of my life. If I can see students know and experience Jesus, for me, that's to live. In fact, if at my funeral, the next generation, some of the people are lining up and thanking me, that would be a life worth living. In fact, I'll never forget coming to this church 5 years ago and hearing that our student ministry's mission statement was helping students take next steps with God. And I said, that's something I can get behind. That's something worth living for. For James, for Paul, to live is Christ. For you, if you had to redefine what it meant to actually live, to actually experience life, something worth chasing outside of your own skin, if you had to put pen to paper, what would it be? Because with our time left here today, this is what we're gonna do. We're gonna look at the remaining words from Paul to the church of Philippi. As he encourages them not only to set a life worth living, he's told them what he believes it should be, right? To live as Christ, to die as gain, but how to live a life worth living. In fact, the first thing we're gonna see, if you wanna live a resolution worth living, is that you have to leave old goals. Watch how Paul says this in chapter 3. The context here is he's still talking about living like Christ. This all comes back to chapter 1 where he says to live is Christ. And this is what he says right here. But whatever were gains to me, I now consider loss for the sake of Christ. Right before I was in these chains, Paul had some goals. He doesn't say what it was. Maybe he wanted to be the best church planner. And maybe he was a tent builder by trade. Maybe he wanted to build great tents. I don't know what his goals were. But before this, he had some, and my guess is you do too. That car, that house, that promotion, something that you've been chasing after. And he says, now that I've got this new goal, right, whatever were gains to me, I now consider loss for the sake of this new goal, which he says is Christ. What is more, I consider everything a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whose sake I have lost all things. I consider them garbage, that I, Paul, may gain Christ. I had these things I used to go after, probably not bad things, but when you put them compared to this resolution for Paul, worth chasing after, a life lived as Christ lived, these old things have not only become losses, they've become garbage to him. And my guess is you have some things right now you're going after that if you're going to actually go after a resolution worth living, that you have to leave behind you. In the Fireball household, we say this a little differently. We say you may have to leave what you want now to go after what you want most. You may have to leave what you want now, what's right in front of your face, to go after what you want most. I was trying to think of an illustration to really explain this. And so I was thinking, man, I've only lived in Michigan 5 years, but what do these Michiganders really love? So I was trying to narrow it down. I think I've got it. You Michiganders, what you love most, I think, are your yards. I mean, there is some of the greenest grass I have ever seen in my entire life. I don't know if it's because you only have a yard 1 month a year or what it is, but you guys love your yards, right? If we would treat people like we treat our grass, this would just be a great place, right? We love our yards. And so let's say what you wanted most was a green yard, green grass. And let's say you walked outside to your grass, right you're on the sidewalk, and your car is parked straight ahead on kind of the side of the street. And you knew that the quickest route would be to cut across the grass to your car. That's what you want now, would save you a minute to work, but what you want most is a green yard. And so you know you could cut across, because that's what you want now, but if what you want most is a green yard, you can't have both. But here's what happens. One day you're running late to work. So you walk outside, and what I want now is to cut across my yard. It's an illustration, calm down. And you get in your car, and you take off, and you come back, and what happened? You look at your yard, nothing happened. And this is where Satan tricks us. He says, see, you did it once, and you can have what you want now and what you want most. Man, sleep with whoever you want right now, and you're totally gonna have a healthy marriage later. Swipe that credit card all you want right now, and yep, you're gonna have financial freedom later. You did it once, nothing happened. But over time, you cut across that yard, and you cut across that yard, and what happens? You get an awesome brown stripe leading to your car, because you can't have what you want now and what you want most. And my guess is if some of you actually get this passion to go after something worth living for, that you're gonna have to leave some things in front of your face behind you. Some goals that possibly walking through these doors you were chasing, but are actually the very things getting in the way of what you want most. A purpose, a resolution worth going after. And my guess is if you'll take me up on this, and you'll leave these things behind, leave that relationship, that comfort, that just hour where now you're serving or whatever it is, you will begin to see that in the context of this purpose worth chasing, these things like Paul are garbage compared to the vision and the resolution ahead. Not only are we going to see from Paul that you need to leave old goals if you're going to live a resolution worth living for, but you need to set small goals. Now, you might be saying, Joel, did you not just tell me to set bigger goals? And I did. In fact, I hope some of you in here set goals so big I can't even fathom. Goals that are impossible to accomplish on your own. I hope some of you in here, you have this deep passion, and your goal is to end the slavery that still exists in this world. I hope some of you, high schoolers in here, Your goal is to reach your entire high school. Adults, I hope it's to reach your entire neighborhood. I'm talking about massive goals. But anyone involved in any sort of leadership training would say to get to those goals, you have to have smaller, clearer, attainable, achievable goals. In fact, I love the way theologian Kevin Malone from the sitcom The Office says this. He's not a theologian. Yeah. He says this right here. It's the end of the year, okay? Very end of the year, he's got a few days left. And he said, I said that I would eat more vegetables, and I haven't yet. But it's okay, because I still have time since last year I ate none. And I honestly think Kevin's on to a little something here. Hey, if his goal is to be healthier this year, I'm going to eat a vegetable. And next year it's 2. In fact, there's a book out there called Mini Goals, M-I-N-I, Mini Goals. And the author talks about making goals so small they're impossible to fail. He said he had this goal to work out 30 minutes a day and he couldn't physically lift himself off the couch. So he changed his goal to 1 push-up a day. He said, who doesn't have time for 1 push-up? He said 9 times out of 10 when he got down to do 1, since he's down there, he did 5 or 10 or 15 or 20. In fact, he did so often that he changed his mini goal to 5 push-ups a day later on. And before you knew it, he was working out 30 minutes a day. And my guess is some of you have these huge goals. Good, you want to reach your neighborhood for Christ? Start with 1 neighbor. Start with 1 dinner. Start with 1 text. Do it right now. God will forgive you. Just text them right now. Right, you've got these massive goals. You want to end world slavery that still exists? Partner with an organization today. Sponsor 1 child. Put on auto pay. A goal so small you can't fail as you begin to move towards your large goal, because far too often we can come in here, we can be inspired, we can have this goal, something worth chasing after, and then we walk out and never begin it. Sometimes it's the hardest part. In fact, I love the way Joe DeCina puts this. He's the creator of the Spartan race, that race you go through mud and chains. I don't know, you crazies do it. And this is what he says, Joe DeCina. He says, the hardest part about a Spartan race isn't actually doing it, it's getting to the starting line. Some of you have this purpose, this resolution worth living for, and today's the day you start somewhere with smaller mini goals to get to this large goal placed on your life. Watch the way Paul puts it. Philippians 3, verse 13. Brothers and sisters, I do not consider myself yet to have taken a hold of it. Right, this is a big goal. He's talking about living like Christ, to live as Christ. I'm not there yet, but 1 thing. I love that, but 1 thing I do. Hey, this is a big goal. I haven't got it, but I've done 1 thing. I've started somewhere. Paul, what is the 1 thing? Forgetting what is behind me and straining toward what is ahead. Man, I'm nowhere close to accomplishing this, but I forgot my past. I'm in chains now. I have no future of hope of getting out, and I'm going to move towards this goal. Everyone in this prison is going to hear about Jesus before I leave. The jailers are going to know every time I open my mouth, I am striving towards this resolution worth living for. I love the way Charles Spurgeon puts this, talking about smaller things becoming bigger. He says, courage my heart. Go on little by little, for many littles will make a great whole. Well, today what we're going to talk about is not only do we need to leave old goals if we're going to go after a resolution worth living for, not only do we need to set small goals, but finally, we need to set eternal goals. Because I believe with my entire heart, if we view our life on this earth in the context of eternity, it would change the way we walked the streets we walk today. In fact, Paul has figured this out. I don't know how. I'm not saying I'm there yet, but Paul had. It's how he's able to have this goal, and he says this right here in the very next verse. He says, I press on toward the goal, right? We know his goal to live as Christ, and he says to win the prize. Now, if you study this passage, you know that word prize is not an earthly language word, right? There's no prize he's going to get. The jailer's not going to come in and be like, Paul, I have your goal sheet. It's to live more like Christ, and you're doing it today. Extra scoop of soup. Like, this is an eternal prize he's talking about. In fact, he makes it crystal clear. He says, to win the prize for which God has called me heavenward in Christ Jesus. Man, many would ask, Paul, in chains, how are you writing one of the most encouraging letters of the New Testament? In prison, it's because he is viewing his life on earth in the context of eternity. And so with the little life he has left, it's to live as Christ. In fact, I believe, I said this earlier, if we set our resolutions in the context of eternity, it would change our earthly resolutions. And so let's do that for a little bit. I want you to actually picture eternity with me. I want you to actually, in here, picture this entire side of the stage right here, all the way to that wall over there, as eternity past. God always was, God always has been, right? Now, I didn't forget about you guys. I want you to picture this entire side of the stage, all the way past the baptism to the wall over there, as eternity present, eternity future, right? God always will be. In fact, if you're followers of him, you will spend eternity with him forever and ever and ever and ever. And then I want you to picture this music stand right here as humanity as we know it. Not just your life, all of humanity, right? All of humanity, eternity past, eternity future. Now picture from the very beginning, here's Adam. God said, Adam, it's not good for you to be alone, and so he created Eve, and he said, thank you. Fast forward a little bit, we got Jesus. Fast forward a little bit, we have the Renaissance. This has nothing to do with anything. I went to the Renaissance Fair this last summer for the first time. And if you're gonna go next summer, don't bring your kids. Fast forward a little bit, we've got the Reformation. We've got World War I. We've got the Great Depression. World War II. Run out of space. 57 Chevy. And here's you. Honestly, I want you to picture your life on this speck in the context of eternity. And we get so caught up with what happens on the speck. I want you to picture your start date, the year you were born, and the year maybe, you're gonna go, and this kind of dash in between. That's your life, compared in the context of eternity. And yet we're worried when we're late to a meeting. We're worried when something breaks or something gets dented or someone says something. And Paul somehow has learned to view this speck in this context. And he said, while I'm on this speck, I'm gonna chase something worth living for, worth dying for. And for me, he says, Paul, to live is Christ. Because if I die, everything is to gain. I love the way Jesus actually states this in the book of Mark. Jesus says this, Mark chapter 8. We'll look at the second part of this verse on the screen. But for whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. The life Jesus is talking about here is this speck. Hey, you want to gain all of this? Lose this. Set a resolution worth living for on this, and what is to gain is everything. There is so much to come if we can learn to lose this, to set a resolution worth living for. But Jesus is pretty clear. These aren't just any resolutions worth living for. What's he say? He says, but for me, this speck, and the gospel, and you will save it. Now, maybe you're new to church and you've never heard this word gospel. Gospel literally translated means good news. And believe me, this is not just any good news. For me personally, this is the most extraordinary news I've ever heard in my entire life. In fact, Mark clarifies what the good news is 2 chapters later. He says this right here. For even the Son of Man, this is Jesus, did not come to be served. He's talking about Jesus coming to this speck. And he could have came down as a king, and he still would have humbled himself. Philippians 2 talks about this. But he came to serve to this speck and to give his life, the sacrifice, as a ransom for many. Did you catch that? The gospel is that Jesus had a resolution worth living for. In fact, he had one worth dying for, and it was you and it was me. And so he gave his life on this earth so that you and I could redefine what our life on this earth means. And this changes everything. I mean, do you realize this gospel message that Jesus came down from heaven and for 33 years in his life lived a perfect, sinless life, and then went to the cross and sacrificed his life? He could have called down angels to save him, but he didn't, for you and for me, and this is his resolution worth living for. And when I hear that, when I hear this gospel message, do you realize it's not the first half that I get emotional and teary-eyed about? Right? It's not the half that Jesus lived a perfect life, that he lived a good life. It's the second half. It's not that he set a resolution, it's that he sacrificed himself and his life to make this resolution possible. And can I tell you, 242, my fear is that we as Christians are only understanding the first half of this gospel, and that we are giving our life, our resolutions, to be better, to be more sinless. And it's not a bad thing, but there's a second half of the gospel that involves an awful lot of sacrifice. And I believe as followers of Jesus, if you're a follower of Jesus and I'm a follower of Jesus, we are called to follow him into that. Not just setting a resolution, not just being a better person, but being outside of ourselves and living this life on this earth with eternity in mind for something worth living for. And if you begin to do this, it will change everything. And I'm not telling you need to leave these doors and go crazy. I'm not saying you have this resolution worth living for and you need to leave and quit your job, but you probably need to quit something. And I'm not telling you need to walk out those doors and buy a plane ticket and leave the country, but you're probably gonna need to leave your comfort zone. Now, I'm not telling you need to walk out this door and deplete your savings and write a check and give everything to this resolution worth living for. But in the context of eternity, you realize whose money this is, and I'm telling you, you probably need to give some of it. Because this will change the way we think. These will no longer be resolutions about meeting our own needs, right? We hear that so often. My resolution is saved to get a new car because this car didn't meet my needs. House didn't meet my needs, I got a new one. Job didn't meet my needs. My least favorite is church. Didn't meet my needs. You begin to realize as followers of that gospel message, we were never called to have our needs met, but meet the needs of the world around us. And I desperately believe if this church in 2019 could set resolutions worth living for, we could change these cities we live in. We could change the high schools we're a part of. We could change the workplaces that right now are desperately in need of some light. I believe that if individually as the church, we could come together and set a resolution worth living for, worth dying for, it could change eternity.